Okay. Well, welcome, bienvenue, and miigwech to the September 29th presentation of the Historical Society of Ottawa, with tonight's topic, Tunney's Pasture, the story behind Ottawa's Field of Dreams. Our guest speaker tonight, Dave Alston, has been a much-needed advocate for Ottawa's West End, helping to tell the story of places like Hintonburg, McKellar Park, and Britannia through his website, the Kitchissippi Museum. I'll give you that web address at the end of the talk. Since 2015, he's been a monthly columnist for the Kitchissippi Times newspaper and occasionally contributes heritage stories for CBC and the Ottawa Citizen. Dave is a senior asset manager for heritage assets for the Department of National Defense and is president of the Wellington Village Community Association. And most importantly for us tonight, he is on the board of the Neighbors for Tunneys, a community group which is striving to convince the government to let the community have greater input in the future development and redevelopment of Tunney's Pasture. I'm sure Dave will have a lot more to say about that tonight. So everyone, would you please welcome a familiar voice in West End manners, Dave Alston.
Great, thank you so much for that introduction, and hello everyone, and thanks for coming to the presentation tonight. Obviously, this is a bit of a strange thing, doing it online. I normally, love to do these live and with a big room of people, and I can walk around and kind of talk to things. So it's a bit awkward sitting in my dining room as if I'm at a work Zoom call, but so be it. It's the way things are these days. So, well, first off, I want to thank the Historical Society for having me to do this presentation. It really, truly is an honor to be asked to do something like this. It's kind of a validation of, as a historian, that, the work you're doing and the stuff you come up with is sort of useful and of interest. And so I really do sincerely appreciate the being asked to do this. So and I'm glad to see a great crowd showing up for this. And I know there'll be probably more watching it online as time goes on. For me, obviously, Tunney's Pasture is close to heart. It's in, I've lived around it my entire life, and my family's history dates back in the area to the 1870s. So I've always had a close tie to the area. Both my parents worked at Tunney's Pasture, as I'm sure many of our attendees or family members have. So, it's a really important thing. So tonight, what I'm going to do is I'm going to cover as best I can in under an hour the history of the Tunney's Pasture property. And I was at work the other day and kind of mentioning it to some colleagues, and someone made the joke about how dry that might sound, that Tunney's Pasture is a government thing, and how exciting could that be? And I was like, well, you'd be surprised at what was there kind of before the 50s when the government arrived. So a lot of the focus of the presentation is going to be that 1800s, early 1900s era, when there was this series of almosts and what ifs and sort of close calls that came to the land. So that's what to me really makes this presentation really interesting. And for me, I don't like to just talk and read dates and figures. I like a visual presentation, especially when I'm attending something like this. I want to see a lot of photos. So I've thrown in a lot of photos. It's going to be photo heavy. I'm winging this in a little bit just because I want the photos to kind of make the presentation move ahead. So my goal tonight is kind of to entertain you with some of the back history and share some stories and photos that maybe you've never seen before. Some of you have maybe read some of my things. Some of it will be familiar, but for the most part, it's just sort of a 100 and 200 year kind of history of Tunney's Pasture. So anyway, so without further ado, I'm going to start my presentation sharing, and hopefully this just goes super smoothly. All right, and there we go. So hopefully everybody sees that. Is that good? Lynn, is that good?
Yes, that's perfect.
Okay, great. So I'm going to flip around here and we'll get going. So the starting point, so all the way back to the 1830s was when Nepean Township was first laid out. And just like rural farmland areas today, there was lots and concessions made out, certain reservations made for clergy space for the churches. And on this map from 1830 that was made by Anthony Swalwell, we see those sort of Nepean Township lots and concessions. So the downtown Ottawa area is sort of in the A, B, C, D, E, F, G you see on the right. And there you can see it kind of the top middle, you see the islands that were now off of Island Park Drive over the Champlain Bridge there on the left, right? So that's sort of what it looked like. And you see an early Richmond Road kind of running from right to left across the top too. So that's where things started, and land grants happened. Of course, there was Indigenous occupation and traversing through the lands, back before this time. And my presentation tonight's going to focus on sort of the modern history, so the post-1800 history that I have records and photos and whatnot for. But of course, it's important knowledge, of course, that was so who occupied and lived on the land prior to that. So in 1801 was when the land grants first were laid out, and the lots we're talking about here for Tunney's Pasture were the lots between 34 to 37. And so I don't want to get too deep into this map here, but the double lots sort of indicate the main street. So the ones going left to right are Scott Street and Carling Avenue for the boundaries of the different concessions. So these farms, as you can see, were 200 acres wide, large. And they were long rectangles that stretched from Scott Street to Carling, basically. And then north of Scott, you can see it was called the Broken Front because those little farm lots were very small and had an inconsistent sort of border at the front. So without getting into too much detail, it was United Empire Loyalist daughters who were gifted the land that made up Tunney's Pasture. So lots 35 and 36 were given to a woman named Jane Stother, who was the daughter of Finley Grant. And 34 was to a Janet Ann Rose, daughter of a Duncan Murchison. Neither of the Stothers or Rose families ever even saw the land. I'm sure they lived, southern Ontario and would never have seen the land. But later on, their descendants would acquire the land, and that's where the sort of future became. So this is kind of what I'm talking about here, about how those lots look now. So taking the Tunney's Pasture layout into consideration, so you can see how big those lots would have been. So the very first kind of item of note in the history of the Tunney's Pasture area was the arrival of Nicholas Sparks. Yeah, the Nicholas Sparks, the one who sort of owned half of downtown and who Sparks Street is named for, and basically one of Ottawa's first sort of most important prominent citizens. Well, he established his mill at the north end of Tunney's Pasture and at the north end of where Mechanicsville is today. And that was in I don't want to get bogged down in dates, and 47 was when he arrived in. And I'm not going to go into the history of Sparks, but he was working for Philemon Wright, and this was sort of an investment because he was sort of got his fingers into everything back at the time. Sparks did. So he owned it right up until the time of his death.
Please check your connection or use a different speaker.
Oh, sorry. Okay. And he owned it right till his death in 1862. And anyway, later on, he added another lot next to it, which was a future Bayswater location. So he owned quite a bit of land there over the time and established this mill. Now, that mill, of course, operating in the 1850s, 1860s, there's not much evidence of that. There's no photos, there's no proof. But where the residual bits still show, where it's the first ever plan of Mechanicsville at the north end, you can see here on the screen at the top, there's some buildings that were sort of still there, the foundations and some of the bits and pieces of those buildings. And they even appeared on the 1879 map here you see on the right from the Belden Atlas. The next screen here has some close-up of them. So you can kind of see where those buildings were down by the water. That would be just about where the parkway, the off-ramp to Parkdale runs now today and loops around the water there coming back to Parkdale. Now here's an aerial photo. I love aerial photos, and that's a good place. So these are from the first sets of aerial photos from the 1920s. And you can just make out at the top, this again it's hard to really place, but again, that's kind of the same area there and around the water where the off-ramp will be, and you can just make out the traces of those foundations from those old mill buildings. That's in 1920, so that was a good 70 years later. And here's some more. So again, this is 1921. You can see at the bottom right some traces of Mechanicsville there at the sort of north end of it, and you can see more evidence of where there was activity on that land dating back to the mill days. And then sort of the north end of Tunney's Pasture as well. Now I'm going to get more into aerial. There'll be a lot more aerial photos and different things of Tunney's to come up, but just wanted to cover off that important era of the Sparks mill. Now it was kind of left to decay, and that was sort of the end of that in 1862. Now next up then was the acquisition of the property by the lumber merchants of Ottawa. And that's important because they were sort of purchasing it, not for the land value. The land of Tunney's Pasture was never all that valuable because it was so rocky and poor for farming and poor for any sort of other use. So it sat vacant right into the 1900s. But they bought it for the water rights because it was the little chaudière was out off the water. And so they had rights that would to the sort of the logging and the access through the land. So it was a good investment. So lumber, these lots I've been talking about, 35, 36, 37, went through the hands of some of Ottawa's most prominent lumber people, like the Bronsons, the Westons, the Greens, etc. Right? So the lumber merchant was sort of a syndicate of some of the main lumberers who were purchasing land for that investment. Again, they didn't do anything with the land really until later on, but it was just sort of investment and again, for those water rights. Now, the most notable piece of history from this point in time involving the lumber merchants is in 1875, when they gave approval to one of the clerks and under Godfrey Green's firm, which was called the Upper Ottawa Improvement Company, to manage his field and pasture animals, and that man was Anthony Tunney. So that's where the Tunney name first arrives in. He was just one of the workers for the firm, and he was one of the first purchasers of a lot in the new Mechanicsville subdivision. Now, Mechanicsville was first laid out, actually the 200-year anniversary is coming up, the 150 anniversary is coming up next year in 1872. Was when it was first laid out. The first lots were sold, and one of the first buyers was Anthony Tunney, who was a recent immigrant from Ireland. And he bought a lot on Parkdale Avenue that overlooked what today would be sort of the Tunney's campus. And just by convenience or by location, he was sort of had the idea to use some of the land to pasture some animals and take care of some of the lumberers' animals. So there was pens set up, and he would have overseen them. He owned a couple of animals, but very rarely. It wasn't like he himself owned a lot of animals. It was largely that he was kind of the caretaker for them and for the property. So I want to switch to the next screen here. So this was a 1875 Nepean Township roll. So putting the pieces together is always fun as a researcher, right? Trying to put together the Tunney story. And this just shows him listed on that assessment roll book in 1875. And he's in the middle line there. I'm not expecting to sort of decipher this, but at the very far right, you can just make out 2 number 1s, and that's under number of horses and numbers of cows, I think. And he has 1 of each in 1875. So that's sort of the first evidence of Tunney animals in 1875. This is just an article, so a profile done of him in 1955, that's just showing, that he didn't really own those animals. It was mostly that he watched over them. He was the big thing that came about was that because he took care of it for so long, there was an important ownership right that came about later on. That he could have had ownership of the vast and soon to be valuable piece of real estate just because he'd been making the tax payments on it. But for whatever reason, at one point in time, he had declined ownership of it. There's no definitive sort of reason why, and it's kind of inconclusive. It's just sort of stories over time. But ultimately, the lumber syndicate sold the land off for $40,000 in 1896 to the Ottawa Land Association. Those of you who've read some of the stuff I've written before or have done research, you know that the Land Association was sort of in cahoots with the railway and electric company for the rights. And so they bought up a lot of the farms along the way and ultimately did the streetcars out to Britannia and whatnot. And this was just another part of their investment. So Tunney kept on an agreement with them to watch the animals for another 4 or 5 years, but ultimately it was around 1901 when he stopped having anything to do with the property. So when the assessor visited in 1901, he was about 60 years old, and that was sort of his last trace of having any animals. Now, he had built on the original lot, he had built a house which burned down, and then so he built a new house which still stands today at 64 Lyndale, and it's this house here on the left. He built that in 1891, still stands today and still looks pretty much as it would have back then. And then on the right is a house that was built in 1999 for his son at 201 Parkdale. It got demolished in 2009. That's where the Soho Parkway now stands. But that's an old photo of it there. So kind of neat that a house that he would have built or lived in for a long time was still standing. So that's kind of cool. And then when he died in 1915, Tunney, for all the future namesake that we would have for him, right? Tunney's Pasture is one of the most well-known names in Ottawa. There was no obituary even in the paper, no write-up. I mean, he lived a fairly, low-key life and certainly had no fame or fortune from his years of doing what he did. And I'm sure the legacy that he has would probably surprise him to know that here we are 105 years ago having a presentation about him and his name, from basically what was a part-time job to him. So that's kind of interesting. So going through that, we're going to keep going chronologically through the history of Tunney's, and up next, so we get through sort of the animal stage. Well, going on kind of simultaneously at this time is in the Tunney's Pasture property is that it was being used primarily for drainage. I know it's kind of an unexciting topic, but it was a key feature of the land for quite some time. And this is an aerial photo from 1920. It basically shows you the entirety of the Tunney's Pasture property with the water on the right. You can see a little bit of early Champlain Park at the top and Mechanicsville at the bottom. Well, cutting right through the middle in a couple of spots are some intentional ditches that were built to drain the water out. And that is where in the springtime, the farmers' fields would melt all up along Carly and Baseline, and just due to the elevations, the water would naturally flow down to the river. Well, the early days of Wellington Village, the entire area would flood, and Hampton Park, same thing, and all around Island Park Drive, heavy flooding. So these ditches were made to help get the waters out. And if you've read any of my stuff on Cave Creek, or if you have an interest in it, that's a really interesting topic that on its own, but that was part of that flooding problem. So there were some prominent ditches that ran through the property, and ultimately that's where Huron Avenue now today has some of the bigger branches of the underwater stormwater sewers to take away the drainage instead, and that runs kind of the same route that it did back then. So drainage was a big topic. And here's some more evidence of it from 1933. Again, you can see, and just some of these aerial photos might be interesting too, just because it shows you just the sort of ugliness of the land, right? Like Tunney's Pasture, like there are a few trees, mostly just rocky, kind of few streams and creeks, just kind of an ugly property that was never that desirable to build on. The next little story then was the slaughterhouse. So back in the late 1800s, there was a big issue in Ottawa about slaughterhouses and how butchers would get their meat. And the costs of meat were rising in Ottawa because they had to go to Montreal and Toronto for their meat, because the law said within the city limits that butchers were not allowed to house and kill animals within the city limits. But there was no public slaughterhouses or stockyards available for people to use, for the butchers to use. So for a while, butchers were doing it anyway, and the police were kind of turning a blind eye. But ultimately, there was a heavy pressure to get some kind of a slaughterhouse set up. So the Tunney's property actually wasn't even part of Ottawa till the annexation in 1950. So it was still in the Peen Township, technically just outside the city limits. So in 1898, they set up they had plans for a big slaughterhouse and glue factory and refrigerators to house up to I think it was about 75 butchers that would able to use the land. So they started building some of these buildings, and I think the first thing that got built was the glue factory and a few sort of barns and whatnot that were built on Tunney's Pasture. But there was issues with that, and one of the biggest issues was in the price of the land. And the cost was to maintain the land. They wanted to get taxation exemptions. There was no water and sewage services. So it was in an odd place. So it was right off the train line, which was handy because where the Transitway goes today was the old CPR rail line. So they could build a line off of there. But ultimately it was a sort of a difficult spot. And then over time, the neighbors, of course, as you can imagine, who lived in the areas right around there, particularly in the Robert Cowley subdivision of Ottawa West, which is sort of the Carlton, Rockhurst, Spencer Streets area. That was the first little pocket. Well, they could, they were dealing with the smells and the runoff and all that. So anyway, it ended up being a complete failure. The slaughterhouses never really came. There was a glue factory there only for 3-4 years until it was closed down. And ultimately, there was never a public stockyard or slaughterhouse that was made for Ottawa in the end, but it was a heavy topic politically for years and years. Anyway, once that closed down, the Butchers Association that formed this syndicate, the Ottawa Abattoir Company, they went into the real estate business. And so that takes us to kind of the next step in the Tunney's Pasture history, which is called Eldenwood Park. And this is an ad that appeared when they first launched this subdivision. So they actually laid out streets and lots. And here's a map from 1913 showing that, and you can see at the top a little bit of Riverside Park, and then you can see the 3 streets they created there: Gainesboro, Elmdale, and Woodbridge Avenue. And they offered lots for sale, and as you saw in the ad here, I'll flip back to it. The ad, they had an auction of lots. They had you could buy a lot for $100 or $150, I think, through the office. They hired prominent auctioneer William Cole to do the selling, but not a single lot ever sold. There's not a record of any lot selling in that subdivision. So it took 3 years of trying, or maybe they gave up quickly, I'm not sure. But 3 years later, having not sold anything and having a kind of a failure on the subdivision, they sold the entirety of the lot to a James Murphy of Fort William, Ontario. And this sort of adds to the next kind of twist to the future history of Tunney's Pasture, which is its tie into what was called the Georgian Bay Canal scheme. And I think I've got so here's one more clip of this. Is the Eldenwood Park subdivision. You can see all the different lots and stuff for that planned community. So the Georgian Bay Canal scheme. So this was interesting, and some of you sort of deeper history aficionados might be familiar with this. And for those of you who aren't, just to kind of keep it simple, essentially, it was an attempt made to construct a canal that reached from Montreal and the St. Lawrence all the way west to the Georgian Bay. Canada at that time had really poor canal systems and really poor internal shipping mechanisms and getting supplies out. So this was thought to be a way to solve that issue. And so you can see the route that it was going to take and connect up. And so when this was proposed, I think there was a company incorporated in 1898, and over the next decade, they started to build some momentum on building this thing. It was determined that anything waterfront in Ottawa might suddenly be a little more valuable because of this canal route. And in Ottawa, there was no municipally owned land along the water at the time. So the Tunney Pasture property was kind of sought after because this is where you could set up and have docks and have some industrial buildings in there, and factories. So, it became popular again. So this guy, Murphy from Fort William, Ontario, had kind of come to the city and said, buy my property. So the city took out a 3-month option in July 1911 to buy it for $75,000, the entirety of the property. And Murphy had only paid, I think, $6,000 or $7,000 for it a few years earlier. But it required a vote of Ottawa taxpayers. So they actually had a kind of a referendum, a plebiscite, to vote on should Ottawa buy this big Tunney's Pasture property for this purpose. So they took out ads promoting it. So there was very first ad, it was almost a no turnaround time between when they took the offer out and the vote. And they actually had the vote, which would have been 6 cents per year for each Ottawa citizen per $1,000 of their assessment. So we're talking literally pennies for them to buy it. And the city promised they would only allow kind of bona fide manufacturers to come on the site. They weren't going to allow investment speculation. It was strictly going to be to help build up Ottawa and provide this canal connection. The vote lost pretty handily in all the wards, and there was actually 3 other votes happening at the same kind of referendum at the time about expanding the waterworks and bringing more pressure to the glebe, and also constructing a steel bridge over the banks, like at the Bank Street Bridge over the canal. All 3 of those passed. This one did not. The city tried again. So a few months later, they tried to do another attempt to do this land purchase. And they put together a heavy advertising campaign. Like, it was amazing. They put together, at the time, pretty cool thing for 1912, which was video clips, like moving pictures that they presented at 4 theaters in Ottawa, showing video, photos, maps of the Eldenwood site, and sort of promotional ideas about why we need to purchase it. So unfortunately, this ad you're seeing on the screen now, this is what they ran in the Citizen, and it's the only one that survives that has the kind of cool photos of Tunney that you can kind of barely make out. But unfortunately, the page on the original microfilm was damaged. But heavy advertising campaign, and they put banners throughout the city. They had cards placed on streetcars, posts on billboards, and on all these newspaper ads. And what happened was, on the last day beforehand, the separate school board came out in strong opposition to it, claiming that the city would not guarantee the board half the taxes from the industry that would locate on the site. And so the separate board came out and sort of told all their people, do not vote for this. So I thought, I didn't include it. So I thought I had another clip here, but essentially the headline read, on the morning of the vote, Catholics urged not to support Eldenwood publicity scheme. And sure enough, they pushed it and pushed it. The board said Catholics would be out $35,000, half the purchase price, and get no return. And the city argued, said, no, well, we're not selling it to give it away. We're going to be reselling it to industry to come in. But ultimately, once again, the purchase lost, and that was it. And the Georgian Bay Canal scheme never succeeded anyway. But the fallout of this was that the city could have owned that Tunney's Pasture property at that time for the low price of $75,000. And you wonder about how the history of the land would have changed if they had purchased it, but it fell through and instead sat vacant for another 30 years. Now, over time, more proposals would come up, and that's where the next one comes up here. And this is from the Federal Plan Commission of 1915. And some of you may know this is the Holt Bennett Commission, which is kind of like a precursor to the Greber Plan of 1950, right? So this was in just pre-World War I, where the Federal District Commission, the precursor to the NCC, had arranged to have this elaborate plan made up to beautify Ottawa. And so it came out with this rather thick book and included all these proposals about where to put industry and where to reroute trains and all that. And our area here, Mechanicsville, Tunney's, and Champlain Park, were all identified as where we would group and put all the industry, lumber, and warehousing for all of Ottawa. So kind of a neat proposal. It didn't go anywhere. The whole Holt-Bennett proposal really never gained steam. And there's posts, if you're curious to go Google on it, there's arguments about why that was. But ultimately, World War I disrupted it, and then the Depression and all that. the NCC, or at the time the IOC, I guess, never had a chance to get it going. So anyway, interesting where that could have gone. But here's some more. I took a couple clips from the book itself, and you can kind of see the blue area here. Shows you where that industry was planned for. So kind of taking in a lot of LeBreton Flats and all the way into Champlain Park. So if that had taken hold, if the NCC at the time had done that, again, completely different future for our area, right? So there you can see all the blue for that area. So luckily we avoided that one, maybe, because God, it'd be so different now. So next up in the history, the one thing I wanted to cover was the existence of a quarry and lime kilns in the area at the end. So this would be sort of at the far tip of Tunney's Pasture now, sort of on the other side of the parkway, where you have the sort of viewing area and the sort of parkway, the multi-use paths down there. This photo, I mean, it's hard to find evidence of this stuff, but there's two photos, this one and the one after it, where you can see a clear quarry at the far end. And the evidence of this comes from a bit of newspaper evidence, and mostly I've borrowed some of this from my friend and colleague, Bob Granger, who's written about this area. And he had interviewed two people whose family, I guess, had been in the area and who recalled and brought up this quarry and lime kiln that existed there. So a very interesting kind of history. And I guess what it was that you'd have a shaft created to close the cliff edge in the quarry, about 6 feet in diameter and 10 feet high, and then limestone and wood would be added, and then the wood ignited, and the resulting lime was then used in construction for construction purposes at the time. And then the rock and whatnot that would be pulled out of there as well was used in the construction, and I guess the lime as well, in the construction of a lot of the houses in the area at the time. So in the 1920s, 30s, and that was right up until the 1930s that it was still being used. And so some of the early aerial photos, if you do look across at that corner, I don't know if it shows better on the other one, but there's obvious paths there worn through, because that's where people were coming with wagons and carts and pulling rock and different materials out from that quarry. So kind of another neat piece of the Tunney's past. Now we're getting into more proposed subdivisions of the area. So there's two that I want to quickly cover off here, and one of them is kind of neat, and it actually did succeed a little bit, and it was called the Mechanicsville Extension. So this is going to be hard to situate yourself with, because none of the names are the same here, but 5th Street was the longtime name for Parkdale Avenue. So what you're looking at here are the streets to the east of Parkdale, which would be in Mechanicsville now. So you've got Forward and Hinchy and Crothers there. And then on the other side, you've got a street, one west of Parkdale, which obviously doesn't really exist now, which is 6th Street, that was sort of imagined at the time. And this whole little subdivision was laid out to lay out Mechanicsville right to the water's edge, but also to create this new street on the west side of Parkdale. And that was laid out in 1908 by the Ottawa Land Association. And it did have some places. So I just want to cover off a couple of buildings. So some of you who have lived in the area a long time may recall some of these existing, because they were there right up until the mid-50s when they expropriated for Tunney's Pasture. There was a series of buildings. So there was about 5 or 6 commercial buildings from the river up towards kind of Stoner or Emerson. And then there was a series of houses closer up to Scott Street. So these are just a few samplings of the businesses. So at 30 Parkdale Avenue was the Parkdale Manufacturing Company that sold this fire alarm product, which ironically they had 2 major fires that burned them out and ended that company at one point. So that's kind of ironic. Then you had a building company called J.A. Cronier's, which was next up at 110. And they were there for some time. Then there was a factory at 120 Parkdale called the Rupert McClellan Company, and they produced windows, sashes, doors, and trim. And they were one of Ottawa's biggest home builders too, McClellan was. Well, they had a fire just 3 years after they built their warehouse. That's a photo of it there. And then next to them was this place called the Twin Pin Company that designed clothespins. And that was there. And they had a bad fire in 1951 as well. And then there were some houses. I could only find one photo of a house, but it was at 208 Parkdale Avenue. And you can see it there up on the rails to be moved. And it was going to be taken over onto Emerson Avenue. I don't believe it's still there now. But what happened was with the expropriation, everything that they basically expropriated during the 50s and 60s for the Parkway and for Tunney's Pasture, there was a Crown Assets Disposal Corporation that would then list these houses for sale. And for a very cheap price, you could buy the house. You just had to move it. And you don't see it too often these days with the moving of houses, but back then there was quite a bit of it happening. So each of these properties were put up to be moved. So you can see this is another aerial photo, and this is just to show you the Parkdale Avenue to show you. So at the top is that duct. So Parkdale is sort of the first street you see running left to right through the middle, and you can just see kind of in the bottom left corner about 5 or 6 houses, and then all those commercial buildings sort of next to the vacant field. So that was all there until the expropriation for Tunney's Pasture in the early 50s. Now there was another subdivision the Ottawa Land Association laid out, and it created basically a series of streets in between Parkdale and that old Eldonwood subdivision. And you can see now these are names you've probably never seen or heard before, like Ford, Norfolk, Markham, Lanesboro, and Kensington. Those are streets they laid out once again to try to sell lots in that Tunney's Pasture property. Once again, it didn't take. No lots were sold. The real estate market had dried up, the depression hit, and so they only really ever existed on paper. Interesting tidbit about this, though, because the lots didn't sell, and this was kind of the last Ottawa Land Association property sell-off, they ended up just surrendering the property unsold to Nepean Township. So all those streets you see from Woodbridge over to Parkdale, that was that OLA property. When it didn't sell, they surrendered it to Nepean Township for unpaid taxes of $6,706 in 1937. And that's about, a good 2/3 of the Tunney's Pasture property. And they just turned over for unpaid taxes of basically $7,000. Pretty crazy to imagine, right? The value of that land today. Then in 1949, so just 10 years later, Nepean Township would actually receive $56,000 for that same property in the expropriation. So they made some money off of it, but even they got a little bit ripped off over time. So next up is the big story, and some of you may have read about this, and if you haven't heard this story before, then this is kind of to me the sort of highlight story of the history of Tunney's Pasture before the government, and that's the Shanty Town that was there for a good 25 years. So this is another really cool aerial shot that just shows you the land, sort of the Tunney's area as it was in 1927. So just before the Shanty Town arrived. That's why I like this photo. Now this is hard. Like I've got a bunch of photos. I'm going to give a quick run over of the Shanty Town and then she'll go through a sort of a photo. I've got about 15 or 20 photos of it to show, some of which I haven't shared before. So it'll be the first time that you'll see some of these. But essentially what happened was after the war and into the 30s with the Depression hitting, there's a major housing shortage in Ottawa. There was no social services really to speak of aside from a few organizations and churches. And so there was really nowhere for some homeless people to go. And so they formed in different pockets of Ottawa. There's a few different sort of shanty towns, but Tunney's Pasture for sure had the largest and most significant. This photo you're looking at from 1944, if you look all along the water's edge, you can see little structures, little buildings, boxes. And that's basically what they were. They were 1-2 room structures made entirely of just cardboard, tar paper, and found materials. And people would live in these. There was families with 8 to 9 or 10 kids, and some of them lived there for 20 years. And they lived there year round, and there was no services, there's no heat, no cooling. They just had what they had. This was a really hard story to research. I spent years on this, and the only starting point I had were a few tidbits of memories from people and 1 or 2 photos I'd found at the city archives. So connecting the dots on this and writing the story was, to me, probably my favorite thing I've ever kind of covered. And it was hard. And I think, and a lot of the people who lived there or associated with it didn't want to talk about it. And kind of, even in their own lives, probably just, covered it up or didn't want to speak of it for years because it was, to live in a shanty town. So here you can see even the first government buildings are coming in 52, and there's still some shacks up there by the water. So they were there right until the mid 50s. And the shacks were heated with a stove in the middle of the room that was crudely vented through a wall. Entire families would share a single mattress or just sleep on the earthen floor. And people would hunt around Mechanicsville or Hintonburg or the early Wellington Village houses, kind of panhandling and looking for help. At its peak in 1952, so when this photo was taken, actually, there was 27 families and over 100 residents. And you can read more about it if you go through my Kitchissippi Times articles or Google the Tunney's Pasture Shanty Town. You can find out more. But this was a profile done in the newspaper from, I think this was from 42, where they were kind of talking about the families. And some of these photos you can see, I'm just going to kind of go through them quickly here, but you can see just the conditions that they lived in are just, shocking, really. And these are, houses homemade and the people lived in. So I'm glad some of these survived. I'm glad some photos were taken, but it just shows you the extent of it. And I was lucky. You're going to see in a moment. Yeah. So there's another photo of the shack. And you kind of, if you look long enough at the photos, you can make out buildings in the background that are, Beach Foundry or in Mechanicsville. But I met a woman, Carol Fex, I think was her name, and she had some family photos that her family were there for, I think, 10 or 15 years. Great photos that they took, and I'm happy to share some of these with you. And these are photos taken in the Shanty Town at the time in the 1940s. And you can see some families, they had 6, 7 kids and barely the clothes on their backs, and this is what they had. So, but the thing that's kind of cool about some of these photos is that in all of them, most of the people are smiling and happy, even though they're basically living, homeless. They still made the best of it and had sort of positive spirits at the time. And so you can just see some of the photos here. There's one. So this was a wedding that they had. I think that happened right at the water's edge at Tunney's Pasture, where they had the wedding for some of the residents of the thing. This photo I like. So it's 5 of the men of the Shanty Town just kind of hanging out and posing for a photo. So yeah, I think. Oh yeah, so this was one story that kind of really gets you, is the Kilmartin story. So this was after World War II. Him and his British bride, and they had 2 children, came back and had to live in a tent there because they weren't able to find a home. And he'd served with the Cameron Highlanders. Anyway, that article ran, and it drew people out to the Citizen who offered a home or a place, but for a lot of the families there, they weren't there. And then, some Mechanicsville residents were happy to help and were offering, water, whatever they could do. There's a story from the late 40s where the Ottawa Works engineer had to step in when they found out the Mechanicsville residents were sharing pails of water to residents and ordered them to stop because of they're using up the water or sharing water they shouldn't have been. So, so you would think that there would be a lot more stories of devastation and fire and injury through this, but really there was just one fire, and I mean, one's too many, but shockingly just the one bad story, and that resulted in the death of one girl, Linda Boyer, who died, and she was only 3 years old. A 2-year-old daughter, Linda, at the time. That was in 1952, and obviously it tore through their 10 by 14 shack in seconds. And so that these photos here show the results of the fire. And then I think I have, that's a photo of the girl that died. So I think it was her niece that I spoke to who had some of these family photos that survived it. So where that went was that the NCC, the Federal District Commission, had come through and started trying to charge rent to the squatters at first, but they banded together and refused to pay it. And ultimately, they kicked them off because the parkway was coming, and so they forced them out. But by that point, by the mid-50s, social services were a bit better. The real estate market and rental market was a bit easier, and they were able to find people homes. But there was one family, I do have in my notes here, the Bourguignon family. They'd lived in their shack for 15 years and saw the birth of 4 of their 11 children there. And I'm sure it was probably a difficult transition for them to leave, because that's all they knew for that long, right? So, or maybe it was probably really easy, I don't know. But anyway, it was a hidden story for a long time that, that hadn't really seen the light of day. So when I share this, it was kind of a really interesting story to share. And so here's when the news broke about how they were taking over, the Federal District Commission was taking over. So anyway, there's one last photo. All right, so moving ahead, now you're getting into the 1940s with the property, and you can see this is a photo of Scott Street looking east standing at about Ross Avenue towards, you can see Grange Avenue there, and on the left is what was called the Burgess Axe Factory. And this photo was taken just at the right time because that factory was only there for a few years. And in the 40s, it was decided that, Tunney's Pasture was going to become an industrial location again. So they were back to that kind of scheme, and they started sectioning off pieces and selling it for businesses to come in and run and set up factories. So Burgess was the first one to come in, and they sold axes. Like, this is a couple of the axes that were made. And so Jerry Burgess was the man who ran the company. And he purchased 15 acres, built the building, applied for water and sewer services, but the nearby residents were against it because they didn't want the factories to come into the area. So they fought against the Burgess Axe Factory, and they asked the city not to grant the water access services off Scott Street, which they did, and they arrived. They added railway siding and business opened kind of that year, but it only operated less than 3 years. And by the summer of 48, they got the expropriation notice that the federal government was coming in to take over the whole site for the government compound of Tunney's Pasture, right? So, so the factory, that big factory that you saw back here, that's the best photo I have of it. This is a good profit for this Burgess guy, because he bought the property for $2,000 in 1945, and he sold it to the federal government for $130,000 3 years later. So quite the profit. So I don't think he had a sad heart tearing down his factory after that. So the factory was removed soon after that. Now the other company that came in, and you can see the factory there on the right, but it was the Albert Canal factory or warehouse, if you will. And of all the stories of expropriation and loss to deal with the Federal District Commission and the creation of Tunney's Pasture and the Parkway, maybe one of the hardest stories is Albert Canal. And again, this is another story that Bob Granger has been working on. And I should mention Bob, if you know, he wrote the Westboro Beach book and contributed to the wonderful Woodruff book. He's also working on something on the Champlain Park neighborhood that's supposed to be due out at some point soon. And I was chipping in and helping a little bit before. And so I'm really looking forward to that. And so a little bit of the canals, he's been in touch with the son, I guess, and hadn't shared a lot of this info. But so Canal was a longtime home builder in the West End. A lot of the Wellington Village houses and Hindenburg houses of the 30s and 40s were built by him. And he bought all those lots on Gainesboro and Elmdale Avenue that you saw in those earlier plans. He bought 256 of them in 1946 and began building a house at a time, pretty much. And the houses were unique and built custom and really cool things. So there was this whole street. Let me just see if I have it. Yeah, Gainesboro Avenue. So which is basically the extension of Ross Avenue on the other side of Scott. Well, you can see all the houses that he built by that time, right? Well, he started building these things, but he was suffering. So right after World War II, you've got materials shortages, you've got manpower shortages. There are all sorts of issues in Ottawa at the time that he was dealing with. And here on the street, they had no services like water and sewer still. So he's building his houses, people are buying them, and then people were having to visit houses on Ross Avenue to get water from taps. Again, city engineers are stepping in and saying to Ross, send a notice out to Ross Avenue residents telling them not to share the water from their taps to these residents. So quite the thing. So a lot of these houses had outhouses and were using their backyards to go to the washroom because they just hadn't have the sewer services in yet. Anyway, in 1948, so just 2 years after Canal bought all these properties, he got the expropriation notice. So now his big mill, all his houses, and he had this big planned community he was going to slowly take over street by street, was now out the door. And he was given a very short time frame to move his houses or risk just them being lost. And then the issue too was that he wanted to move some of them to Northwestern Avenue, but there was rules in place about building permits and moving houses that said that streets had to have services in order to have a house moved to it. The city of Ottawa wouldn't allow it, so he was stuck with some of these houses. Plus, he couldn't agree with the Federal District Commission on the price he was going to get for that expropriation. So it was just a real mess. And to hear Bob tell the story in better detail, just a tragic, tragic story for this Canal guy and for what could have been. So ultimately, all these houses you see here and a few others that were probably built after that plan was made were all sort of moved or destroyed, within a year or two of them being built. So that's kind of covers that story. So now it takes us kind of to the Tunney's Pasture kind of era here. And I have the last 20 or so slides dealing with that. It's largely photos, so I'm going to whip through, and it's more of a history of Tunney's built up through photos. So I don't want to get into the minutia of government, land purchases and all that, and the buildings and stuff, but I think it's best told through photos. So really, it was in 1947 that the expropriation notices first started going out. And at first it was rumored to be a spot to house the new Dominion Bureau of Statistics building. And certainly by 48, that's when the news broke about what was happening. So this was sort of, people woke up this morning, March 2nd, 1948, to hear the news of what was coming. And that was the plan. So a big news break. And so the Federal District Commission ended up spending over $700,000 in expropriation money to acquire all the site. And they started work not until 1950 to expropriate. So it was July 1950 when the first bulldozers came out and started taking. Unfortunately, the photo isn't good here, and the original is long lost. But if we could see that photo, it would be, I think, interesting to see the first bulldozer at Tunney's Pasture in July of 1950. Now, I like this photo. Again, it's not the greatest detail, but you can kind of see the first buildings going up in 1955. And I like how they sort of labeled each one, and you can kind of see those first buildings. Now, the photos do get better. These are the last couple newspaper photos that I've used, but you can kind of see there's the hygiene laboratories for the Department of Health at the bottom, and then, of course, the main building, the stats building on the top. And these are from 55. And then, let me just see here. Yeah, so the first four buildings were the power plant building for public works that was started in November 50, the virus laboratory and the financial building for finance, and then the Bureau of Statistics building in January 51 that started. And really it was by mid 53 the first buildings were up and running. And Tunney's Pasture, I should point out, came about as a part of the Graeber plan, right? The vision for Ottawa to have centralized government services, and what they wanted in sort of a isolated park-like setting. So actually, when this first started launching, when they first started building up Tunney's Pasture, they were supposed to change the name to Tunney's Park. But local residents or the Board of Control or whatever voted that down, so it remained Tunney's Pasture, but very nearly became Tunney's Park. And they wanted to sort of build it up with this slow sprawl, 1, 2, 3-story buildings with all kind of the same material, the same scaling, the same massing, in sort of a wide campus look. And that was sort of the thought at the time. So you have this sort of gradual buildup of Tunney's Pasture where the first 1950s buildings all look like that. Then you see the towers come in the 60s and some new additions and stuff that kind of go against that to kind of, and there really hasn't been much new building in Tunney since. So, so here you're seeing that was the Archives of Canada building that got built in September 56 when it first opened. So here again, I'm just going to flip through a few photos, and just to go through, and you can kind of see, you can keep an eye too. I love these photos. There's 100 things you can look at here, but like seeing Mechanicsville build up, or there's still no parkway yet. Seeing Scott Street and the rail line there. I think you can see the train kind of crossing, about Holland Avenue there. So anyway, I love old photos. So that's May 1960. Here's another view from the east looking a bit west, and you can kind of see the build up there, so kind of cool. And a lot of these are available at the City of Ottawa Archives and through the City of Ottawa website as well, the Archives website. Now this is a shot, you can see Tunney's at the top, and this is kind of looping around past Westboro Beach here, going up. This is when the parkway was under construction. Just to say a few notes on that for those of you who are curious. So the parkway kind of, again, that was an expropriation that cost $10 million to expropriate all the land. And that was a huge thing, because where you see the roadway come, this was all filled with houses and cottages all the way to from Woodruff and all the way through Westboro and Champlain Park. And you can see this photo really shows you how it absolutely cut off the communities from the water that was so important. And sure, they built a few culverts and underpasses, but it really wasn't the same. And it really kind of isolated those communities all for this parkway. So here you see it kind of in progress in 63. And I did write an article about it. If you haven't seen it, you can probably Google it. There was 3 phases of it. And the first phase opened in December of 63 that ran just from Parkdale to Churchill. And then a year later, December 64, all the way up to Woodruff. And finally, it was just a bit late for Canada Day of 67 for the centennial, but it went all the way downtown to Wellington and then west to Carling, just in the mid-July 67. So there you see the Brooke Claxton building under construction in 63. And there's a color photo of it here from in behind. So this photo I love too, because it's an early color photo from the air. And you can see Beach Foundry there at the top as well, just on the other side of Scott Street. Very cool photo, and again, showing the progress. Here's a shot from 64. So Claxton's finished and some other buildings have come in. This is kind of the snapshot of the first phase of Tunney's Pasture, for lack of a better word. And then you can see the nice tree-lined streets there with the new trees in there. Here now in June 72, you're watching the Coates building go up under construction. So that's that tall building just off Scott Street. And it was named after Canada's first chief statistician, Robert Coates. It's 26 stories, and it was completed in 76, I guess 75 or 76, open for business. Here's a shot I love from the mid 70s. So this is before the last rail lines were pulled up. This is one of the trains that were coming out. You can see the siding that going to the left. So it would go across the Holland and Scott intersection into Beach Foundry. And then it would go down west towards sort of Caroline Avenue and then go back downtown, sort of in a Y to move out. So this is basically right where the Tunney's Pasture LRT station is now. So here's a shot from 74. So again, another sort of busy day at Tunney's Pasture there. You can see a ball diamond set up by Scott Street and sort of all the other buildings. Now the Jean Talon building's missing, but I think the next photo, no, this is 79, still no Talon building in there yet. But you can see the parkway and everything set up there. And then, yeah, so here's the Talon building when it was fresh and new in 1980, built into the building. That's where my dad worked there for 30, 35 years in that building, and still kind of looks exactly the same now, very unique kind of look. And now this presentation would not be complete without a quick mention of the nuclear reactor at Tunney's, which I know a lot of people have read about, and that's all thanks to Andrew King. So anything I'm sharing on this is all courtesy of him. These are his images and I'm only going to spend a minute on it just to cover it because it's worthwhile. But if you haven't read about it, definitely check out his website, which is ottawarewind.com, or just Google nuclear reactor Tunney's Pasture and you'll see his great story on it. But some of you see that at the very bottom right, that bunker, that concrete circular thing that you probably have walked by or biked by on the pathway. It's tied into that, and you can see it's now a parking lot, but where that nuclear reactor was located is in sort of that parking lot at sort of the north end. So basically the story is that, here, let me just get my notes here. It was in 1970 that Atomic Energy of Canada placed what was called the Slowpoke 2 class nuclear reactor at Tunney's Pasture. And it was basically a commercial testing reactor to test its feasibility to work. And it was in full operation from 71 to 84 till they moved it out to Canada. And the concrete bunker that you see was built right around the same time. And it was built, and there's a big trench where the red line went, you can see. It was built to bring in cooling water to help with that reactor, basically for that purpose. So it was a 3,000-foot pipeline that was put in there. It would run 35,000 gallons per minute through this 42-inch diameter pipe that goes under the parkway. And then it would also be used to return the water through. So that was a $2.5 million cost just to build that pipeline and bunker. And anyway, there's lots of photos, like there's still evidence of it all around. Andrew King took some amazing photos of some old hatches and vents and stuff that still exist for it. Now, I think it's still in use now, that used in air conditioning and cooling, that they still bring the water in there through it. But obviously the building was gone in the mid 80s, that Atomic Energy building that had that. So anyway, a very neat story and kind of a shocking thing to imagine that was there. Oh yes, and this is an image that kind of what the reactor would have looked like at the time, and sort of there's a picture of the bunker there. So again, I encourage you to go and read Andrew King's article on it. It's very interesting. And then I think I have one more slide left, and it would be remiss without mentioning it, is the future of Tunney's Pasture. And this is something I've been heavily involved in over the last year or so. This is the best photo or visual you're going to get so far. In 2014, the Tunney's Master Redevelopment Plan was released, talking about what would happen to the future of Tunney's Pasture. For all of us who live in that neighborhood, it's obviously a great concern. But that was 2014, that came out, and we've heard nothing on it since, right? So we were compelled to start a group to sort of push for information to say, okay, what plans are happening here? What kind of public amenity space we're going to get? What kind of green space? Because it's all happening in a silo. We weren't privy to any of the information of it. So we met, we put some pressure on it, and resulted in us in getting a meeting with Canada Lands and Public Works to get some information. And they released this pamphlet that came out. Some of you who live in the area may have gotten it. It seems very inconsistent what streets got it and which didn't. But ultimately, it's a big combination of a planned 3,700 new residential units, employee space for 25,000 employees, a lot of commercial, some green space, some unknown amenities. And I wish I could share more than that with you, but that's all we know. And so our main thrust has been to get more information shared. So before the election was called this fall, there was supposed to be some information sessions coming up for the public this fall. Those have been pushed off probably till the winter at best, but then we'll know more. But certainly there's a heavy residential component at the west end of it, near Northwestern. And then we've been told along Parkdale Avenue on the west side of Parkdale, opposite where they're putting up all those new condos now, there'll be almost a wall of them there too on the west side. So that's all we really know, dribs and drabs of information, and hopefully we'll get more soon. But you know, the future of Tunney's is I mean, we've seen it, the presentation will show, there's been so many almost and what ifs. Well, it's had its course of 70 years as a government hub, and that certainly is changing. There's 3 buildings that are heritage designated, which will stay, are supposed to stay. And obviously there is plans to keep some government there, but ultimately you're going to see a lot more intensification in that area. So anyway, I think that's the end of my presentation. So, with that, I just want to say, thank you for attending, and thanks to the Historical Society for having me. And I'm very much open to any questions and comments you might have. I'd be happy to hear it.
Yeah, I've got some questions here for you, Dave. First, thanks for a great talk, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. But a couple questions here. Do you think there are still any unearthed burial grounds on the site?
Burial grounds? I don't think so, only because it's very rocky, and I don't think that, I think you're meaning like human remains, or I don't think that was ever the case, that it would have been used as for any kind of burials, as far as I've seen in my research. And just because of the quality of the ground and the high rock amount, I don't think it's possible that there were any there.
Did the government plans in the early 1950s anticipate abandoning the CPR railway tracks along Scott's in the mid-1960s?
Did they anticipate it? I don't believe so. I mean, Tunney's acted independently. There was never a siding for the government. There wasn't a stop there. The CP rail went by it, but it was really, there was a stop at Westboro, and then the station at Bayview at Ottawa West Station, but there was no tie-in for the government to it. It was in the 80s, obviously the early 80s, when the last tracks came out, and then they trenched out for the transitway, which now is very short-sighted, because they pulled up all these tracks to just 40 years later, put in more tracks into this trench now. But no, I don't think that there was any anticipation of how that would go. Although at the time with the Graber plan, they certainly were moving things around. Like they took the train station from downtown and put it at Tremblay Road. And certainly there was that push to get trains and tracks out of the central areas. So, probably that was part of their discussions, but it was, like I said, it wasn't, they weren't affected by that.
Okay. Is there any kind of, do you know of any kind of historical or memorial plaque on the history of Tunney's Pasture? Someone suggests one at the LRT station.
Oh, that's that's a great point. So I had a role, I got pulled in last year into the Tunney's master plan meetings for my history and heritage background and knowledge. So I got to participate in some of the plaques and memorials that were going to be placed up around. So, and that's part of what alerted me to the seriousness of how far advanced some of these plans are that they aren't sharing with the public, is that they're at the point where they're making the display boards and the plaques. So, that just shows you how far along it is. But no, there are definitely a few things planned and a few sort of display areas. And so I've had some input on that. They are definitely doing something for the Shanty Town and for Tunney himself. So there's some things planned there. I'm not supposed to share too much of it, but I think it's safe to say that. But yeah, that's a great question.
Yeah, I'm just thinking, something on the Shanty Towns, which I had no idea about until tonight. That would be a great story. Yeah. And if someone suggested by the LRT station, because it's such a busy area, it would be something that people would see. Yeah. A couple of questions here. We'll see if you want to answer from people. Why are the feds moving out? Is there a reason why they're leaving after all this time?
Well, I think a big part of it is that a lot of the buildings have run their course, their useful life, and it's a huge amount of valuable real estate. So I think it's just a matter of when a building becomes surplus in the government, or when it becomes, it hits a certain condition level or becomes too expensive to do intervention on, it becomes surplus, and the government then has to sort of analyze whether it makes sense to put money into it or rebuild or relocate. And so that's basically what this project is I don't think you're going to see the entire Tunney's property sold in one foul swoop. I think you're going to see pieces of it sold off over time and development slowly creep in as the buildings, as we've seen, I think 2 or 3 come down in the last couple of years, and you'll probably see that happen. So, there's still the intention, as far as I know, of keeping some departments there, but we've seen it even downtown, departments, RCMPs out to Barhaven. I'm at National Defense. We've gone out to Bell's Corners. There's just exodus from downtown, and now with people working from home, who knows, right? But I think it's a conscious decision that, based on the buildings now being 7 years of age and failing in a lot of cases, that this is just the right thing to do.
Yeah, I think from my experience with the LRT being there now, the land value is so much more valuable as residential.
Yeah,
and governments best to move up. They can get more money in residential and Canal offices. Someone asked, someone just says, your opinion on the future. I guess that means on future development, the last slide you showed. Do you have any opinions on that, or is that maybe too sensitive a subject?
No, well, I think, I can, like our community association, the 3-4 neighboring CAs got together and we ran a survey last spring to get input from the residents, so that it wasn't just 3-4 presidents talking to the company, right? We wanted to make it say, here, we're representing the views of, I think we had 500-600 people reply to the survey, and sort of the obvious things came out about, it wasn't as obvious. It wasn't what you might think. I mean, the top priority things were access to the riverfront, keeping green space and sort of natural areas, but then also ensuring that we have recreational space. And we're seeing that, like right now, there's a real lack of community recreation facilities. And now there's talk of Tom Brown Arena closing soon. And so you can't put 3,700 plus new housing units in an area and not add any swimming pools or community centers or soccer fields or whatever. So for us, that was our big push to say, look, like, let's not just, don't give us a little corner park for a couple kids. Like, we need adult facilities here too. And so my hope would be that we'd see something extensive like a pool or a big skating rink, community center facility. I've seen a bit of the plan, so I'm not at liberty to say what I've seen. But that's definitely our push going forward, is to make sure that that gets thought of, right? Because it's so easy to forget about that.
Yeah, and someone else talking about future development, Marcia Armstrong asked a good question. In the final slide that you showed, which buildings could potentially have heritage designation? Are there any there that are worth designating, do you think, under the Interior Heritage Act?
The three, yeah, I mean, the Stats main building and the Claxon building and the health building at the back, they have the 3 designations. I mean, you could make a case for it. I mean, it's tricky now because the developments are underway. It's very hard to get designation once plans are underway. So plus 2, right? You're not dealing with Ontario designation, like what we would do when they're about to tear down a nice old brick home, where you would go to the city and try to get provincial designation. Now you're dealing with FIBRO and the federal protection. So in a lot of cases, these buildings that have already hit 40 years of age would have been reviewed at the time they hit that age. So back in the 90s, and they would have been, non-designated. So it would be very hard at this stage to do that, and probably even impossible in some cases where they've already been reviewed. It's very hard to reopen that. I know this because I deal with this every day at D&D for all of our buildings across Canada, and it would be a hard task to do.
Yeah, that's my experience doing heritage impact assessments on federal government buildings, because it is provincial legislation.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's hard to get federal buildings protected under the Interior Heritage Act. So yeah, it would be a steep hill to climb.
Yeah, I mean, it's in it, like whenever there's provincial designation, we don't have to obey it. Like the feds don't have to, they can ignore it. They don't, I mean, we try to respect it and work around it, but ultimately it doesn't stop us doesn't stop the federal government from doing what they want to do with the property.
Yeah, that kind of frustrates me. It'd be a whole other topic, but I find, just personally, I got to add, if the federal government gives the provinces the authority to designate, the feds should be able to say, well, no, that's provincial authority. We have to acknowledge it because we gave the province that authority. You shouldn't be able to get away with it just because you say we're the federal government. It's still provincial. But anyway, that's my bugaboo on that. Just one more comment, and then we'll close things up here. David Jeans chatted to us that he was speaking to the architect of the Brooke Claxton building yesterday, Stig Harville. I recognize that name, who was then working for Darcy Elmer. Don't know if anyone recognizes those 2 names, architects, not a while. But thanks everyone for the questions that you sent in. And thanks, Dave, especially for a great talk tonight. I generally went into this thinking, oh boy, this is going to be a dull subject matter, because when I would take the bus up to the P and see my mom, well, what a dreadful place Tunney Pasture is. But somehow you managed to add a human element to an area of Ottawa that sometimes seems full of dehumanizing buildings. So thanks a lot, Dave, for a really interesting outlook. And I do want to mention your website. It's a long one, but you can Google it. But it is kitchissippimuseum.blogspot.com. And there's stories of all sorts of things, not just Tunney's Pasture, all stories of Ottawa. So please join that. So thanks, Dave. And one last announcement here. Our next meeting will be Wednesday, October the 13th at 7 p.m. And our guest speaker will be David Dean. And it is a passing by history the Capital History Kiosk Project. So thank you, Dave. Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight, and we will see you in 2 weeks' time.
Thank you.